Hello, welcome to episode 9 of the CH Booth Library's book chat. I'm Anne here with Catherine and Amy, and we are going to talk about books. And Catherine is going to get us started today.
Yeah. Hi, so I'm the YA librarian, so I'm going to be talking about 2 YA books. And the first book I'm going to talk about is The Surprising Power of a Good Dumpling by Wei Chim. I just love the cover. It's just really nice and pink. So this is a book about a girl named Anna. She lives in Australia with her family, and she's dealing with a lot of responsibility. She's helping with her younger brother, and she's also helping with her father's restaurant. So that's kind of where the title comes in. She really likes helping with the restaurant, but she's also dealing with her mother's mental illness. So sometimes her mother can't get out of bed, and sometimes her mother is manic and angry. And so she's dealing with like this intense pressure of like having to help keep her family together while they're going through this very difficult thing. And so like she kind of goes to help with the restaurant to kind of like busy herself so she can distract herself from what's going on at home. So her father is like, he works a lot, so he's not always at home. And when she's at home, she's dealing with her mother's mental illness. So she prefers to be at the restaurant. And so during a school break, she is helping a lot with cooking at the restaurant and that kind of thing. And then she meets the new delivery boy who is named Rory. And there's kind of like a romance storyline with that. But what I really loved about this novel is the fact that it's dealing with a family situation that is not perfect. And I think a lot of people can relate with this kind of situation, but there's still a lot of like love there. So it's a great family and there's great characters, but they're not perfect and they're dealing with some serious issues. But it's also just kind of, it actually, with all the seriousness of it, it actually was kind of a lighthearted read to me. Like I just really enjoyed the characters, and it just was a really, really excellent novel. It took me not too long to read it. So I really recommend this one.
Sounds good. Okay, Amy, you want to go next?
Hi, and I'm Amy Schuman. I'm the head of reference, and I'm in charge of the nonfiction collection. So I picked 2 nonfiction books today. And also because it's March and Women's History Month, they deal with women's history. And my first one is The Genius of Women by Janice Kaplan. And my other theme of all these book chats has been short attention span books, even though they're nonfiction, because my ability to read has been a little bit still impacted by the pandemic, I fear. So what I like about The Genius of Women is a bunch of short chapters that focus on a semi-forgotten woman from history and why she maybe didn't get her due. And it analyzes what we think about genius. And that, of course, the fact that any woman in the past managed to be a successful scientist or writer or astronomer is just amazing because of all the society pressures to not do so. But also that it analyzes how we think about genius. And of course, one of the things about genius is it's not enough just to be smart. It has to be nurtured, it has to be encouraged. And so sometimes when people say, you know, women have not accomplished anything, it's that they just weren't given a fertile ground in which to do so throughout history. So I really like this book because it did some modern people like Oprah Winfrey and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but also did people further in the past who we may not know about so much. And you can always, if you're really fascinated by their stories, you can always do more research and read more in depth later. And so that's The Genius of Women.
Sounds good. Okay, the first book that I'm going to talk about is called, I just have a picture of it here on my iPad. It's called The Mercies by Karen Millwood Hargrave. And this is historical fiction. It takes place in 1617 in a tiny Arctic settlement in the far north of Norway. It's a fishing village, and one day, while the men are out on their boats, a storm comes out of nowhere and unfortunately drowns them all. And this leaves the women alone in this isolated setting. So they learn different roles after the tragedy, and some find that they quite enjoy this new freedom that they have in agency. But of course, they fall under suspicion from the religious authorities for living what they consider an unnatural life with no men around. Like one of the women starts wearing pants because it makes her job, hunting easier, and that's considered quite horrifying to the authorities. So they bring in a witch hunter from Scotland to try to root out those who may still honor some of the pagan traditions that are practiced there from the indigenous people who still live in the area. And this sets up some, divisions among the villagers. And I really loved the historical detail in this book. The descriptions of the landscape, the sea, the weather, they really add to the somewhat foreboding atmosphere of the story. It's a great feminist take on this part of history, tells the women's side of this story, which was inspired by real events. And it's a really great book to curl up with on a stormy day. And I'd say if you're going to read this, take a look at a map before you do, because this is a real village and it's amazing to see where it actually is, and also the lengths that were gone to impose a certain worldview on other cultures, literally to the ends of the earth. So I would say read this if you like historical fiction that's set in Scandinavia or at a pretty early time in history, and also books that have a sort of a gritty realism. And it's also good for Women's History Month because it tells a feminist story. The Mercies.
Is also historical fiction. So this is called 13 Doorways, Wolves Behind Them All by Laura Ruby. And I'm not normally a fan of historical fiction, but this one really captivated me. And it's actually a really hard book to explain because, so it's the straightforward part of it is it's set in a girls' orphanage during World War II. And it's following a girl named Frankie who she starts out in the orphanage. Actually, like her father is still alive. Her mother has passed away, but her father is still alive with his second wife, and they decide they can't take care of their children anymore, so they send him to the orphanage. It's like this weird situation where Frankie still has a relationship with her father, like he visits at the orphanage, but she lives in the orphanage, so it's like, that was upsetting to read, but it's also the strange thing about this book that makes it kind of unique is that it's narrated by a ghost. So it's historical fiction, but it's also a ghost story. So the narrator of the novel is a ghost who like is following Frankie in this orphanage and like telling her story, but also telling her own story. So like how she got to be a ghost. Basically, it's like kind of like a slow build of like what happened to this girl who's narrating the story, and also it's like interwoven with Frankie's story. So I just thought it was really, the writing of this was just so beautiful. And even though I'm not normally a fan of historical fiction, I kind of find them slow sometimes. I was like immediately gripped by this story, dealing with like the things you would expect from a World War II novel, dealing with like men going off to war and you don't know what's happening to them. Frankie has a brother who is like in that age range. So like you have that kind of like sad story, but also a coming of age story from Frankie, and also a ghost. So it's like has that kind of like uniqueness that I just really enjoyed. So that's 13 Doorways, Wolves Behind Them All.
And my second book is Monsters, She Wrote, The Women Who Pioneered Horror and Speculative Fiction. And this is a really good example of cover design because it really gives you an idea what the book is like, that it's lighthearted, it's a little quirky, don't expect a lot of seriousness in it. And it also does things like it covers Mary Shelley, who of course invented the genre of science fiction with Frankenstein, but it also includes, everyone's 70s favorite, V.C. Andrews. And it really is a fun book. Again, it's a quick read because you can just pick it up and read a couple pages. And like I said, there are authors you've definitely heard about in it, like Toni Morrison, like Daphne du Maurier, but you probably haven't heard about. And it just talks a lot about their life and what made them. And it talks a bit about like what, we don't think about women really as being horror writers, but they really, a lot of them are. And it talks a little bit about the psychology of why women are so good about writing horror. Spoiler alert, because so many women are horrific and full of terror. But anyways, so Monsters, She Wrote, and it's by Lisa Kroger and Melanie R. Anderson. And like I said, a nice quick read. And if you're ever looking for more books like this, you can usually find them upstairs around 305.4.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about a bunch of books, not necessarily one longer review, but recently made this flyer of all the upcoming World War II books that are coming out, which is an extremely popular category of historical fiction nowadays. And a lot of these authors are women authors, and they tell the stories of women. You can usually see them pictured on the cover. And so what I have is a bunch of other World War II books that are older. So maybe you're on the wait list for one of these and you want to try something a little bit different. Some of these are women authors, not all of them, and some of them have a little bit of a different point of view than a women's story. So maybe if you're just looking for something different. Now, I have always recommend these books to people, so these are some of my very favorites, but I did read some of them a long time ago. So I don't remember everything about the plot. So what I'm going to do is just read the summaries that are in our Reader's Database novel list to give you an idea of what it's about. Okay, so the first one I'm going to talk about is called The Invisible Bridge by Julie Oranger. And the description of this is a story of three brothers, of history and love, of marriage tested by disaster, of a Jewish family's struggle against annihilation, and of the dangerous power of art in a time of war. And this book takes place largely in Hungary, makes it a little bit different. And I love stories that talk about the power of art. So this was always one of my favorites, and also spent a lot of time thinking about what the title means in the context of the book. It's long and sad, but really an excellent book. Next one is Atonement by Ian Mcewen. A little different point of view here. You might know it, popular. They made a movie. In 1935 England, 13-year-old Briony Tallis witnesses an event involving her sister Cecilia and her childhood friend Robbie Turner. And she becomes the victim of her own imagination, which leads her on a lifelong search for truth and absolution. It doesn't sound like it's a World War II fiction, but the second half takes place during the war, in the war, actual war, battle scenes, and again, it's also a meditation on the power of art, this time the written word, and this was always one of my all-time favorite books. Next one is Mouse by Art Spiegelman. It's a graphic novel, and it really does a good job of explaining the horrors of war. The author-illustrator traces his father's imprisonment in a Nazi concentration camp through a series of disarming and unusual cartoons arranged to tell the story as a novel. So it goes back and forth between present day, or at the time the book was written, Queens, with the author talking to his father about his experiences, and really good for all ages. And if you've never tried a graphic novel before, this one is really good. Next one is called A Thread of Grace. I always recommend this and other books by this author to people because the writing is so beautiful. Mary Doria Russell is the author of A Thread of Grace. In September 1943, Claudia Blum and her father flee across the Alps into Italy with other Jews seeking refuge, only to find an open battleground among the Nazis, Allied forces, resistance fighters, and ordinary Italians struggling to survive. The Italian Alps makes for a different setting, and like I said, the writing is top-notch, and this was one of my top recommends for people looking for that. And then finally, I have City of Thieves by David Benioff. Two young men in Leningrad in 1941 are given a shot at saving their own lives by complying with an outrageous directive: secure a dozen eggs for a powerful colonel to use in his daughter's wedding cake. So this is a little different because it's about two young men. It's a coming-of-age story. It's both funny and tragic. It's good for all ages, popular book club selection. And the author, if you don't know, is also the writer and producer for the Game of Thrones TV show. So definitely a little bit different than the women-centered stories. So those are my favorite, some of my favorite. I had an even bigger stack, but I had to cut it down, World War II novels to try while you're waiting for some of these other new popular ones to come out. Okay, I think that's all we have for our book chat today. So we'll post a link with all these titles that you can find in our catalog. And always we have the bookmarks with our staff picks. A lot of the ones I talk about end up on my staff pick bookmark, and I'm sure there's a display on the 3rd floor for Women's History Month, and we'll try to focus that around the library this month too. Okay? All right. Bye, everybody.